Golden chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom of Ravenscroft Castle in warm light, reflecting from polished marble floors and crystal goblets. Musicians filled the air with elegant melodies, while nobles from every corner of the kingdom gathered to celebrate Duke Alexander Ravenscroft's latest political victory. At only 26 years old, Alexander had already earned a reputation as one of the most respected rulers in the realm. Calm under pressure, brilliant in negotiations, and unwavering in discipline, he was admired by allies and feared by rivals. To the guests, he looked every bit the perfect duke. Standing a few steps behind a throne-like chair reserved for her husband was 23-year-old Lady Amelia Ravenscroft. She wore a graceful pale blue gown embroidered with silver thread, her golden brown hair pinned neatly beneath a delicate pearl comb. A gentle smile rested on her face, though it rarely reached her eyes. Beside her stood 4-year-old Prince Oliver, dressed in a tiny navy velvet suit with polished black shoes. He held tightly to his mother's hand, his bright blue eyes wandering around the magnificent hall with endless curiosity. "Mama," he whispered, tugging gently at her sleeve, "may I have one more honey pastry?" Amelia laughed softly. "Only one more," she answered quietly. A young prince mustn't fill his stomach before dinner. Oliver nodded with exaggerated seriousness before hurrying toward the dessert table under the watchful eyes of nearby servants. Several maids exchanged warm smiles. "Our little prince grows kinder every day. He learned that from her grace," another whispered. Amelia pretended not to hear. Compliments had become something she quietly accepted without expecting them to change anything. Across the ballroom, Alexander stood surrounded by influential lords discussing trade routes, harvest reports, and alliances. His expression remained composed, almost unreadable. He rarely looked toward his wife. That had become normal years ago. When Amelia had married Alexander 4 years earlier, she had believed time would allow affection to grow between them. The marriage had united two respected noble families, and although love had never been promised, she had hoped friendship might blossom. Instead, duty became routine. Alexander was never cruel without reason. He simply remained distant. He worked before sunrise. He attended meetings until nightfall. When he traveled, weeks often passed without a letter. When he returned, conversations rarely lasted more than a few polite sentences. At first, Amelia blamed herself. Perhaps she wasn't interesting enough. Perhaps she spoke too softly. Perhaps she expected too much. But every anniversary, every birthday, and every lonely evening slowly taught her the same lesson. Some hearts built walls so high that patience alone could never climb them. Still, she never complained. She focused instead on raising Oliver. She personally read him stories before bed. She walked with him through the palace gardens each afternoon. She taught him to greet servants with respect, to thank cooks for every meal, and to treat every person with kindness regardless of title. The greatest rulers, she often told him, are remembered not because people feared them, but because people trusted them. Oliver didn't fully understand, but he remembered every word. While Alexander strengthened the duchy's reputation beyond its borders, Amelia quietly strengthened its heart from within. She visited orphanages without announcing her arrival. She organized warm clothing for villages during harsh winters. When palace servants became ill, she sat beside their beds with soup and medicine instead of simply sending physicians. Most people believed these acts were funded by the Duke. Amelia never corrected them. Recognition had never been her goal. Her greatest wish had always been simple: to build a peaceful family. As the banquet continued, nobles raised crystal glasses toward Alexander. To Duke Ravenscroft, the pride of our kingdom, Alexander inclined his head with measured confidence. "Thank you for your loyalty." The applause echoed through the ballroom. Oliver clapped enthusiastically from beside Amelia. "Papa's amazing," he whispered proudly. Amelia smiled. "Yes," she replied gently. "Your father works very hard." At that moment, Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, a wealthy noblewoman known for a sharp tongue, stepped forward with a pleasant smile that concealed obvious mischief. "Your Grace," she said sweetly to Alexander, "may I ask something?" Alexander nodded. "You may." Beatrice glanced toward Amelia before speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I've always wondered, Lady Amelia is certainly graceful, but she rarely attends political meetings or court debates. She speaks so little during gatherings that some visitors hardly notice her presence. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. Beatrice continued, "Wouldn't a duchess with stronger influence better complement such an accomplished ruler?" The music seemed quieter. Conversations faded. Everyone waited. Many expected Alexander to defend his wife. Surely he would dismiss such an insulting suggestion. Amelia lowered her eyes, saying nothing. She had long ago learned that silence often carried greater dignity than arguments. Alexander sighed almost impatiently. His day had been filled with endless discussions, negotiations, and ceremonial speeches. He wanted the uncomfortable conversation to end quickly. Without considering the weight of his words, he turned toward Amelia. His voice remained calm, cold, almost emotionless. "Leave." The room froze. Alexander looked directly into her eyes. "You're nothing." 3 simple words. 3 words spoken without anger, without shouting, without hesitation. Yet they landed heavier than any accusation. No one moved. Even the musicians stopped playing. Oliver looked between his parents, confused. "Mama?" Amelia blinked slowly. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the entire world had become silent. Then she offered a graceful bow. "As you wish, Your Grace." Her voice neither trembled nor accused. She reached for Oliver's small hand. The little boy looked at his father. "Papa, aren't you coming?" Alexander had already turned back toward his. "Guests, go with your mother." Oliver nodded sadly. As Amelia walked across the ballroom, dozens of eyes followed her. Some pitied her. Some looked ashamed. Others quietly lowered their gazes, unwilling to witness the pain on her face. Not once did Amelia look back. She simply walked through the enormous doors and disappeared into the quiet palace corridors. The laughter and music never truly returned. Late that evening, Amelia sat alone beside the window of her chambers while moonlight spilled across the polished floor. Oliver had fallen asleep, clutching his favorite wooden horse. She watched him breathe peacefully. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not because of tonight alone, but because tonight had finally confirmed what her heart had tried to deny for 4 long years. She had spent years believing patience could become love. Instead, patience had become loneliness. She slowly removed her wedding ring and placed it upon the writing desk. Beside it lay untouched letters she had written Alexander over the years, letters filled with hopes, family memories, and dreams she had never found the courage to give him after realizing he had little interest in reading them. She unfolded a fresh sheet of paper. Her hand trembled only once before steadying. She did not write words of blame. She thanked Alexander for giving her the greatest gift of her life, their son. She admitted she had once believed kindness could melt even the coldest heart, but she now understood that love could not survive where it was never welcomed. She promised never to speak poorly of him to Oliver. She wished him peace, wisdom, and happiness. Finally, she wrote one last sentence. "A home without respect can never become a home filled with love. For Oliver's future and for my own heart, I must say goodbye." Carefully folding the letter, Amelia placed it beside her wedding ring. Before dawn painted the eastern sky, a modest carriage quietly rolled through the castle's eastern gate. Inside sat Amelia and the still sleeping Oliver, wrapped warmly beneath a blanket. She took one final glance at the towering castle that had once held all her hopes. Then she faced forward. The carriage continued down the empty road. Neither mother nor son looked back. When morning sunlight reached Ravenscroft Castle, servants discovered the Duchess's chambers strangely silent. Her wardrobe was nearly empty. Oliver's favorite toys were gone. Only a wedding ring and a neatly folded letter rested upon the polished desk. Moments later, Duke Alexander entered the room, expecting Amelia to return after calming herself. Instead, he found only silence, and the letter waiting for him. The letter remained unopened in Alexander's hand long after the servants had quietly left the room. Outside the windows, Ravenscroft Castle had already awakened. Maids hurried to the corridors. Cooks prepared breakfast, and advisors gathered for the morning council. Everything appeared normal. Everything except the silence inside Amelia's chambers. Alexander looked around the room. The vanity where her pearl hairpins had once rested was nearly empty. The vase by the window no longer held fresh flowers she replaced every morning. Oliver's favorite wooden horse, usually lying beneath the bed, was gone. Only the wedding ring and the carefully folded letter remained. For the first time in years, the room felt unfamiliar. He slowly unfolded the letter. The elegant handwriting was unmistakably Amelia's. Alexander, if you are reading this, Oliver and I have already left. His eyes moved down the page. There were no accusations, no anger, no bitterness. Instead, Amelia thanked him for giving her the greatest blessing she had ever known, their son. She wrote about the hope she had carried into their marriage, believing respect could one day grow into affection. She admitted she had waited through every lonely season, convincing herself that tomorrow might be different. Then came the words that settled heavily on his heart. Last night did not break me. It only showed me that my heart had been breaking quietly for a very long time. Alexander lowered the letter. The room suddenly felt much larger than before. He had expected tears, perhaps even blame. Instead, Amelia had left him kindness, and somehow that hurt far more. A knock interrupted the silence. His longtime steward, Mr. Edwin Mercer, stepped inside carefully. "Your Grace." Alexander looked up. "Have they been found?" The steward hesitated. "No, Your Grace." Alexander folded the letter. "Send riders to every major road. They've already departed. The neighboring duchies?" Messages were delivered before sunrise. Alexander nodded once. "Expand the search." Immediately, within hours, the entire duchy knew its duchess and young prince had disappeared. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Merchants carried whispers between villages. Stable hands exchanged worried conversations. Servants prayed quietly in the castle chapel. The concern was not simply political. Many genuinely loved Lady Amelia. She had attended weddings of ordinary villagers. She had remembered children's birthdays. She had visited families after difficult harvests. People did not see her merely as a duchess. They saw her as someone who cared. Meanwhile, Alexander sat through council meetings unable to focus. Advisors discussed borders, trade agreements, harvest forecasts. He heard none of it. One question repeated endlessly inside his mind. Where had she gone? That afternoon, an elderly housekeeper named Margaret requested permission to speak. She had worked at Ravenscroft Castle since Alexander himself had been a child. "What is it?" he asked. She clasped her hands respectfully. "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace." Alexander waited. Margaret continued softly. "Her Grace loved this family very much." "I know." The old woman looked at him kindly. "I don't believe you did." The room became still. Most servants would never dare speak so honestly. But Margaret had earned that privilege through decades of faithful service. She walked toward a cabinet and removed a small wooden box. "I found these while cleaning Her Grace's writing desk." Alexander opened it. Inside were dozens of sealed letters, each addressed to him. None had ever been delivered. He looked at Margaret. "Why?" She stopped sending them. "Why?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because after a while, she believed you had stopped reading them." Alexander carefully opened the oldest letter. Inside, Amelia had described Oliver's first steps. Another spoke of their son's first words. One contained a pressed flower from the palace gardens because Oliver had picked it himself. Another described how Oliver insisted on waiting by the front gate every evening whenever Alexander traveled, hoping to be the first to welcome his father home. Alexander closed his eyes. He had never known, not because Amelia had hidden those moments, because he had never asked. Margaret quietly added, "Every time Your Grace returned from your travels, she prepared your favorite meals herself." Alexander frowned slightly. "I thought the kitchen staff chose those." Margaret gently shook her head. "No, Your Grace." His silence deepened. The following days became unlike anything the people of Ravenscroft had ever witnessed. Instead of remaining inside his study, Alexander rode across the duchy himself. He visited villages where Amelia had quietly organized schools. He walked through hospitals she had funded from her personal allowance. He met widows who spoke of food arriving during harsh winters without anyone knowing who had sent it. Again and again, they thanked him. "We'll never forget what you and the Duchess did for us." Alexander found himself unable to answer. It hadn't been him. Everywhere he traveled, he discovered pieces of Amelia he had never taken time to know. At a small village school, children proudly showed him books donated by the Duchess. An elderly teacher smiled warmly. Her Grace always said knowledge gives hope. Alexander slowly ran his fingers across the worn book covers. He imagined Amelia standing in the very same classroom, smiling at children whose names he would never know. That evening, he returned to the castle exhausted. The enormous dining hall had been prepared as always. A long table, silver dishes, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, his favorite tea. He dismissed the servants. For the first time in years, he sat completely alone. Across the table remained Amelia's empty chair, Oliver's smaller chair beside it. The silence felt unbearable. He suddenly realized he could not remember the last family meal they had shared without interruption. The next morning, Alexander made a decision that surprised everyone. He canceled several ceremonial events. Instead, he ordered improvements throughout the duchy. Schools received additional funding. Village roads were repaired. Medical clinics gained more supplies. Support for struggling farming families increased before winter arrived. His advisors looked puzzled. One finally asked, "Your Grace, why the sudden changes?" Alexander answered quietly, "They should have happened long ago." Weeks turned into months. The search continued. Every report ended the same way. No confirmed sighting. No reliable trail. No sign of Amelia or Oliver. Then, one rainy afternoon, a traveling merchant arrived at Ravenscroft Castle requesting an audience. "I believe I may have seen the people you're searching for." Alexander stood immediately where, a small coastal town nearly 2 days south. The merchant described a young woman teaching children beneath an old oak tree. A little boy with bright blue eyes often played nearby. "They seemed happy," the merchant said with a smile. The boy called her mother. Alexander's heartbeat quickened. He asked no further questions. By sunrise the next morning, he left the castle with only one trusted horse and minimal escort. This journey, he decided, was not one for soldiers. It was one a husband and father had to make alone. 2 days later, he reached a quiet seaside town. The air smelled of salt and fresh bread. Children laughed in narrow streets lined with colorful cottages. Everything felt peaceful, almost unbelievably peaceful. Following the merchant's directions, Alexander walked toward a grassy hill overlooking the sea. Then he stopped. Beneath the shade of a large oak tree sat Amelia. She wore a simple cream-colored dress instead of expensive silks. Her hair was loosely tied back as ocean breezes gently moved a few loose strands. She was reading a storybook to a circle of smiling children. Nearby, Oliver chased butterflies across the grass, laughing freely. The sound carried on the wind. Alexander could not remember the last time he had heard his son laugh like that. Neither Amelia nor Oliver noticed him. He remained standing at a distance, watching, realizing something that no letter could have fully explained. They had not merely escaped the castle. They had found peace. And for the first time since they disappeared, Alexander understood that bringing them home would never be enough. If he truly wished to have his family back, he would first have to become the man they deserved. Alexander stood beneath the old oak tree long after the children had finished their lesson. The afternoon sun painted the sea in shades of gold, and a gentle breeze carried the sound of waves onto the shore. For the first time in many years, he saw Amelia without the weight of court duties, formal gowns, or endless expectations. She looked peaceful. She looked free. Nearby, Oliver laughed as he raced after a bright blue butterfly, his joyful voice echoing across the grassy hillside. Alexander realized something that pierced his heart more deeply than any farewell letter ever could. His son looked happier here than he ever had inside the grand halls of Ravenscroft Castle. Amelia finally noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the field. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. She calmly thanked the village children for coming before sending them home with warm smiles. One by one, they waved goodbye to their beloved teacher. Only then did she walk toward Alexander. "You found us," she said softly. "I did." Another silence settled between them, neither angry nor uncomfortable, simply honest. Oliver looked up from the butterflies. His small face brightened with curiosity. "Mama, who is that?" Amelia knelt beside her son. "You remember your father, don't you?" Oliver studied Alexander for several long moments. "I remember a little." Alexander's heart tightened. He slowly knelt to meet his son's eyes. "You've grown so much." Oliver hid slightly behind Amelia. Children remembered warmth more clearly than titles. Alexander understood why his son hesitated. He had not earned the right to expect an embrace. "I won't frighten you," he said gently. Oliver gave a tiny nod. It was enough. Alexander turned back toward Amelia. "I came to ask you to return." She looked toward the sea before answering. "I can't." He lowered his eyes. "I understand." She looked surprised. "No arguments? No demands?" "No." Alexander took a slow breath. "I have spent months thinking about everything I failed to see." Amelia remained silent. "I cannot erase those years." "No." "I cannot ask you to forget them." "No." "But I hope one day you'll believe I truly regret them." Amelia looked into his eyes. For the first time since their marriage, she saw something unfamiliar there. Not pride, not certainty. Humility. "I need time," she replied. "I know." Rather than returning immediately to the castle, Alexander rented a modest cottage at the edge of the same coastal town. The villagers were surprised to learn the quiet newcomer was the Duke himself. Yet Alexander asked for no special treatment. He repaired broken fishing nets alongside local fishermen. He helped rebuild an elderly widow's garden fence after a storm. He carried heavy baskets through the marketplace without announcing who he was. People quickly noticed that he worked harder than he spoke. Several evenings each week, he visited the small school where Amelia taught. He never interrupted her lessons. Instead, he quietly helped arrange books, repaired old desks, and swept the classroom floor after the children went home. Amelia watched all of it without comment. She wondered whether this gentle man could truly be the husband she had once known. Oliver remained cautious at first, but children possess remarkable honesty. One afternoon, Alexander sat beneath the same oak tree, carving a small wooden sailboat. Oliver wandered closer. "What are you making?" "A boat." "For who?" Alexander smiled. "I was hoping for you." Oliver carefully accepted the unfinished toy. "It needs a flag." "I think you're right." Together, they carved a tiny flag into the mast. The next day, they floated the little boat in a quiet stream. Soon another followed, then another. Without realizing it, father and son slowly began creating the memories they had missed. Weeks passed. Alexander never pressured Amelia. He never asked when she would return. He simply remained present. One evening, Amelia found him repairing the broken fence surrounding her small vegetable garden. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She folded her arms. "You've changed." "I've begun changing." "There is a difference." Alexander smiled faintly. "You're right." They walked together toward the shore as the sun disappeared beyond the sea. For the first time in years, they spoke honestly. "I used to believe strength meant never showing emotion," Alexander admitted. "My father ruled that way." Amelia listened quietly. "I thought kindness would make people stop respecting me." She shook her head gently. "Kindness and weakness are not the same." "I know that now." He looked out over the waves. "I spent years protecting the duchy and forgot to protect your family." Alexander nodded. "I did." Amelia lowered her gaze. "I stayed because I believed every tomorrow would be different. I'm sorry." "I know." Those two words carried no bitterness, only truth. Several days later, a royal messenger arrived carrying urgent news. A group of ambitious nobles had begun spreading rumors that the Duke had abandoned his responsibilities. Some even hoped to weaken Ravenscroft's influence while Alexander remained away. His advisors urged him to return immediately. Alexander thanked the messenger. Then he walked to Amelia's cottage. "I have to go back." She nodded. The duchy needs its duke. He looked at her carefully. I won't ask you to come. She seemed surprised. You won't? No. He smiled gently. I finally understand that home is not a place someone can be ordered into. Oliver ran outside, carrying the little wooden sailboat. Papa. Alexander knelt. I have to return to the castle for a while. Oliver hugged him without hesitation. When will you visit again? Soon. You promise? I promise. As Alexander prepared to leave, Amelia walked beside him to the edge of the road. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. When we first married, I hoped one day you would see me. I do now. I know. She smiled gently. And that's why I think we're finally meeting for the first time. Alexander's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Several weeks later, invitations spread across the duchy announcing an extraordinary public gathering at Ravenscroft Castle. Nobles, merchants, village leaders, and servants filled the grand courtyard. No one knew why the Duke had requested everyone's presence. Alexander stepped onto the balcony, overlooking the crowd. Beside him stood Amelia. Oliver held both of their hands. The murmurs quieted. Alexander spoke clearly. For many years, I believed leadership meant authority alone. He paused. I was wrong. The crowd listened in complete silence. I failed to recognize the person who carried kindness into this household every single day. He turned toward Amelia. My wife strengthened this duchy in ways I never understood. He looked back at the people. Today I thank Lady Amelia Ravenscroft publicly, not only as the Duchess of Ravenscroft, but as the woman whose compassion taught your Duke what true leadership means. The courtyard erupted into heartfelt applause. Many servants wiped tears from their eyes. Margaret, the elderly housekeeper, smiled proudly. Amelia looked at Alexander. No expensive gift, no grand title, no royal decree could erase the past, but sincere humility had opened a door that pride never could. Months later, life inside Ravenscroft Castle felt remarkably different. Alexander no longer hurried past breakfast. Every morning he shared tea with Amelia and Oliver before beginning official duties. Several afternoons each week were reserved exclusively for family walks through the castle gardens. Oliver eagerly showed both parents every flower he discovered. The servants smiled more often. Laughter returned to the halls. One spring afternoon, bright red roses bloomed throughout the palace gardens. Alexander and Amelia walked slowly along the winding stone path, while Oliver chased butterflies nearby. Alexander gently reached for Amelia's hand. Years ago, he had let that hand slip away without realizing its worth. This time, she smiled and held it firmly. Neither spoke. Words were no longer necessary. The wind carried the sweet fragrance of blooming roses across the gardens as husband, wife, and son continued walking side by side toward the future they had rebuilt together. Not through titles or promises, but through patience, respect, forgiveness, and love that was finally returned. And for the first time since the day they married, Ravenscroft Castle truly became a home.